Welcome back to the program. I'm Zev Brenner. Always a privilege, always a treat to have Dr. David Troy with us. He's a presidential historian. He's written a lot of fascinating books, and he also writes some fascinating articles. And currently, he's a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Good to have you back.
Thanks for having me, Zev. It's always fun to be on the show.
Thank you. You wrote an interesting article about nicknames in the White House. So before I get to that, you've also written an obituary for Bob Dole. So tell us about Bob Dole and especially his relationship with the Jewish community.
Yeah, Bob Dole was a great American, served this great country in World War II, was injured by a Nazi fire and had shrapnel in his body the rest of his life. He went on to become a congressman and then a senator from Kansas, tried to run for the presidency or the vice presidency at least 4 times, never quite made it. And he was... what I argue in my article in City Journal is that he was really defined by 2 great relationships: his friendship with Richard Nixon, which first elevated him in the early 70s, and his rivalry with George H.W. Bush, with whom he competed multiple times for the vice presidential slot in 1976. He won, but the Ford ticket lost, so Republicans did not take the White House or retain the White House. And then he ran against Bush in 80 and 88 and lost both times. And then in 96, with Bush out of the picture, he finally got the Republican nomination, which he so long sought, but then he lost to Bill Clinton. So he had some challenges in his life. Obviously, never got to the promised land, as it were. But he was a supporter of Israel, but I wouldn't call him the strongest supporter of Israel. I would say that the Republican Party today is more supportive of Israel than the Dole wing was back then. But had a lot of Jewish friends, and seems to be mourned by people across America in the Jewish community and outside as well.
Right. He had a good relationship, but today the Republican Party is more pro-Israel. But then again, the Democratic Party then was more pro-Israel than they are today, and the Republicans not as much so, and things have shifted over the course of time.
Yeah, I would say the Democratic Party is less pro-Israel today,
right.
But I don't even think back in the day that the Republican Party that was less pro-Israel was as hostile as some elements of the Democratic Party are today. I mean, it's really worrisome, and I hope it doesn't spread.
No, certainly not. By the way, you were also a Jewish liaison in the White House. Did you notice that this past Hanukkah that President Joe Biden didn't have a party, just had a candlelighting ceremony?
I did, and I was asked about it by the forward. And the truth is, under COVID and the COVID protocols, I understand not having a party. I don't think it was a slight at the Jewish community. So I give him a pass on that one.
You pass on that one. Okay, because people say, what happened to the party? So, and the question will be if there are other ethnic parties, if there's a Christmas party or other parties, if it's a bigger one with food, then we can say what happened to Hanukkah.
Yeah, I think I think I'm giving a COVID pass this year. We'll see what happens next year.
All right, I'm fine. But we should keep an eye on the other parties as well.
I'm happy to criticize the Biden administration on a number of fronts, though, where I think they're doing a bad job, and there's a lot of them, but not on this one.
Okay, not on the Hanukkah party. Okay, that was instituted by Jimmy Carter, by the way. He's the one that I just found out, and you probably know it as being a presidential historian, that he saw Chabad. This was during when he was in hiding with the whole hostage situation in Iran, and he saw the menorah being lit by Chabad in Washington. He went there and he actually lit one of the candles, and that's what started the tradition, I think, in the White House, from what I've been told.
Yes and no, and the first big lighting on the ellipse behind the White House was what was in the Carter administration by Rabbi Levi Shem Tov. But the tradition of a Hanukkah party every year with a lighting in the White House, that started under George W. Bush. It was not a thing that you would have a Hanukkah party every year. And since Bush, they've had some kind of celebration, even if it's the smaller Biden celebration that we're having this year because of COVID.
Now, your latest article is From Huckleberry Capone to Turd Blossom, a history of White House nicknames. Presidents and their aides have long bestowed nicknames on each other, often undermining their rivals. So I didn't realize that everybody had nicknames, and whether it's the president, where they made fun of the president or other top people. But tell us, there's so many interesting ones. But let me look at the one where somebody was called Hamas.
Yeah, well, this is Ben Rhodes, who was a deputy national security advisor, half Jewish, by the way, and he was so hostile to Israel that he was called Hamas inside the White House.
Now, who called him Hamas? Who called him Hamas?
Emanuel, who was more pro-Israel. And in fact, they even gave an example. And this, by the way, in Rhodes' own memoir, he admits that he was called Hamas. If I were called Hamas for hostility to Israel, I'd die of shame. But in his own memoir, he talks about how he was called Hamas by Rahm Emanuel, who said, Hamas over here wants to make it so I can't visit my kid's bar mitzvah in Israel. And he put in Rahm Emanuel put in some curse words along the way. So yeah, that was one of the better nicknames.
So he was proud of being called Hamas.
He was proud enough to put it in his memoir.
That means he's proud to be called Hamas. So
yeah,
you can see the kind of person that he is, Hamas. Any other names that have to do with the Middle East or Israel that you found? Any nicknames?
Henry Kissinger was Jewish, and I didn't find any great nicknames for him per se, but I did find that the traveling press corps that went around with him, they were so pro Kissinger that they were called the Choir Boys, which I thought was a pretty funny nickname.
Now, I find that he had some very harsh nicknames for President Richard Nixon.
Oh yeah, like the Madman and that kind of stuff, right? He was. Nixon made him, and Nixon elevated him. Nixon, when things weren't working out between him when he was National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State, he made Kissinger both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. But Kissinger could be very harsh on Nixon in private. But Nixon also embarrassed Kissinger sometimes. There's one story I tell about in my book, Fight House, where they're talking about some Middle East related issue, and Kissinger says something that's vaguely pro-Israel, and Nixon, knowing Kissinger was Jewish, says, "Can we have the American point of view now, Henry?" Which is pretty harsh, I thought.
Pretty harsh, even though what Roger Stone told me, that when President Nixon during the Yom Kippur War, Henry Kissinger didn't really want to send weapons to Israel, but the president wanted to, so he had to instruct him to do so.
So I wouldn't necessarily believe everything Roger Stone says. However, this happens to be true, that Kissinger was more wary of sending arms to Israel in the Yom Kippur War, and Nixon was adamant not only about sending arms, but he said they're going to criticize us whatever we do, so we might as well send everything we can. And that did save Israel in a very difficult time.
No, it certainly did. Now, let's look at nicknames during the Trump administration. There seems to be a lot of name calling, or I should say nicknames. Nicknames is a form of name calling, obviously.
Yeah. So I tried for Jewish Insider, that item I sent you, Zev. I tried to isolate some of the nicknames that went to Jewish people. So Rod Rosenstein was called Mr. Peepers by Trump, apparently. So I thought that was a good one. And then Jared Kushner would bring in people to help with coronavirus, and they were called the Slim Suit Crowd, I guess, because they dressed kind of in a New York rather than a Washington way. So I also had one that Melania, not Jewish, but Melania didn't leave the White House that much, so apparently she was called Rapunzel because she used to stay at the White House all the time.
And Ivanka Wright was called the Princess.
The Princess, yeah.
And Donald Trump himself used to have nicknames for people, from Crooked Hillary to Sleepy Joe, right? Lying Ted, Little Marco. So he seemed to have encouraged. Was there more nickname calling during his administration than others?
I think so, but it's also, we have the media reporting on it more. But it seems like there were a lot of nicknames in this administration, and there are these recent books that have come out by by Michael Wolff and Michael Bender and Carol Leonig and Bob Costin and Bob Woodward, and that have revealed some of these nicknames. And one of the things I'm trying to do is I keep a rolling file of nicknames in every administration, which is how I was able to write this article. And so far, I haven't found much in the Biden administration. Apparently, Mike Donnellan, who is an advisor to Biden, who doesn't say much on phone calls, he was called Mr. Silent because he didn't weigh in on phone calls. So hopefully I will find more nicknames from the Biden administration as time goes on.
Yeah, I'm wondering why there isn't, because unless it's under the Trump administration, there was a lot of fighting amongst the different aides. Are we seeing less of that in the Joe Biden administration?
There's definitely fighting. We read about Kamala Harris and her disagreements with the other stuff. So there's some fighting. But Biden does not like what he calls process stories, which are stories about infighting. And so because the aides know that he doesn't like those stories, they try and tamp them down. And Trump, they were happy to have stories about infighting, and so the media enjoyed them, and the administration didn't seem to mind them. So it was a combination of factors, but there was definitely a lot of infighting in the Trump administration. And when there's infighting, you're going to see nicknames.
Now, what about, you mentioned Kamala Harris? She's not popular in the halls of the administration, and she has her detractors. So I'm surprised that there are no nicknames, except that I know she calls herself Mamala.
Yeah. That's cute, but it's not the kind of nickname I'm talking about in the
Right.
article.
We're talking about more Derog, but I'm just saying, is there any nicknames, or so far the only one you came up was Mr. Silent?
Yeah, look, I'm somewhat dependent in this situation on reporters and former staffers and memoirs. So and a lot of the nicknames I came on Trump. I mean, the first 3 paragraphs of my article are from recent articles or recent books about the Trump administration by reporters who only had the access they had after the administration was over. So I think we will see more, and I will continue to monitor for some of the great nicknames that emerge.
Let's go back to the Obama administration.
So, well, I mean, we did talk about Ben Rhodes being
Rhodes. I
Hamas,
can't get over Hamas. I mean, let's be proud of that. He
but
should be
James
ashamed.
Jones, who was the national security advisor, was a general and didn't really have a great time in the Obama administration. He called the national security aides, the junior people in the White House who tried to keep him down, he called them the water bugs. I thought that was a good one.
No, there's certainly other words, and you had the Night Stalker too, right?
Oh yeah, that's a legendary one. Valerie Jarrett, who was a friend of the Obamas, but also one of the most senior people in the White House, she would go to the Obamas' residence at night and get whatever policies she wanted discussed with the Obamas. So she would kind of sometimes overturn whatever policy arrangements that happened during the day in the White House. And so it was annoying to staff that she would circumvent them in this way, and they started calling her the Night Stalker.
We're speaking with Dr. Tevi Troy. He is a well-known presidential historian, and he's currently senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Writes lots of articles. It's an interesting article about what takes place in Washington, especially in presidential circles. His latest article is looking at nicknames in the various White Houses. Let's look at Reagan and Bush. I didn't realize. So let's first look at Ronald Reagan, because Ronald Reagan was a popular president, but seems to be a lot of nicknames during his course of time in office.
Yeah, my favorite is not even a person that was nicknamed, but an item, which was Ed Meese, who wanted to be chief of staff, but was not organized enough. There was a campaign against him to show how disorganized he was, and they started making fun of his briefcase, into which papers went in and never came out. So they started calling his briefcase the Meese case, which, as you correctly noted, it sounds like the word for ugly person, ugly person in Yiddish. But no, the Meese case is the nickname of one of my favorites. But also there's David Gergen, who many listeners may know from his time on CNN. He was in the Reagan White House, and he had a propensity for making enemies, and they used to call him Tall in order to try and diminish him. And they would play tricks on him, like lower the podium where he was supposed to give a briefing and then tighten the screws so he couldn't raise it. So he'd look absurdly tall. And his nickname was the Tall Guy, which was then shortened to Tall.
But Nancy Reagan got a lot of bad nicknames, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I can't even name them all. You probably have them in front of you, but yeah, I mean, literally a dozen nicknames I think I listed.
I mean, you have listed Ice Queen, the Cutout Dial, Fancy Nancy, Attila the Hen.
Right, Attila the Hen is one of my favorites.
The Evita of Bel Air, Mommy Dearest. So she seems to have really gotten quite a bit of nicknames.
Well, there's a reason for that, Steph, because she got involved in White House decision making. And she would be involved in hiring and firing decisions. And there were aides she liked and aides she didn't like. And so the way she kind of poked her nose in it, and I don't want to say that in a negative way. I mean, she was looking out for Reagan's interests, and she and Reagan had a very, very tight relationship. But her involvement led to some people mocking her as well. So it's a contributing factor.
Let's go to James Baker.
Yeah, well, James Baker was obviously the chief of staff and under Reagan, and then he comes back and is chief of staff briefly for Bush during the campaign, at which point he's not. The Bush campaign is kind of floundering a little bit, and I think he gets called the Invisible Man by Barbara Bush, because he really didn't want to be seen publicly as leading the Bush campaign, which was obviously going to lose. So she was unhappy with him.
And speaking of James Baker, there's a legend. Maybe you can correct and see if it's true or not. There's a legend that a lot of secretaries of state, when they leave office, they're critical of Israel. So they once mentioned this legend to James Baker, and he said, "What happens if you started out that way?"
I've heard the story. I don't know if I can't. It's apocryphal. I can't speak to whether it's true or not. But he definitely was We were talking about the earlier era when Republicans were more critical of Israel. I mean, he's definitely in that camp.
No, but I was just wondering if there was any truth. It's a funny joke, but I'm wondering if there's any basis to that. But he didn't have any names such as Hamas or any other derogatory names regarding Israel as the other gentleman did.
No, he did not. But
Let,
look,
yeah, go ahead.
he was. I mean, he was a very talented chief of staff. I wish he'd been more pro-Israel. A lot of times people go to the State Department and they're more pro-Israel, and they have to fight the State Department staff. In Baker's case, I think he was less pro-Israel than the State Department staff, which is often saying something.
Because you have a whole own bureaucracy in the State Department. That's even you can have a president pro-Israel. You have a whole bunch of bureaucrats there that are anti-Israel.
Right, you got to fight those bureaucrats.
You got to fight those.
Right.
I don't know if it's changed at all today, but that used to be the case. I assume
it's probably gotten worse.
Probably got worse with the new appointment. Probably. Let's go to the Clinton administration. Did Bill Clinton?
I liked in the Clinton administration. I mean, you had Dick Morris, who was first of all, he was codenamed Charlie when he was secretly advising Clinton, but then he becomes part of the operation, and the other aides don't like him, so they call him the Unabomber. But then George Stephanopoulos, who was one of the people who kind of fought with him, he later left and he went to ABC News, and they didn't like, in the Clinton administration, the way he would sometimes criticize the administration, so they called him ABC News Common Traitor. He was a traitor to the
common traitor, right?
Yeah.
And I love Sid Vicious.
Yeah, Sid Vicious is Sid Blumenthal, also called GK or Grassy Knoll. He was a very sharp-elbowed aide who had a very sharp pen when he was out on the outside, but then once he was on the inside in the Clinton administration, he was out to get Clinton's enemies. And he saw a lot of enemies, or he perceived a lot of enemies, which is why they called him Grassy Knoll. And then he also was so nasty to others that they called him Sid Vicious.
Now, James Comey during the Bush II administration, I didn't realize he had a nickname too.
Oh, I mean, this guy, he's always been sanctimonious, and his nickname is Saint Jim.
Saint Jim, right.
Yeah. But my favorite nickname in the Bush administration is David Addington, who was chief of staff to Vice President Bush. And he was, he was a very sharp-elbowed bureaucratic player, and he won a lot more fights than he lost. And he was nicknamed Kaiser Soze, after the bad guy from The Usual Suspects. It was kind of this dark arts, nefarious player behind the scenes, which I just thought that was a terrific nickname.
Now, nicknames have been part of the American tradition as far back as we can find records.
Yeah, but I really start with Kennedy administration, and I think, what does it matter to have a nickname about a person nobody's ever heard of? And in the Kennedy administration, you really start to see aides become famous people in their own right. And so once they're famous in their own right, then you start to see the nicknames about them proliferate.
But there was bad blood between Kennedy and Johnson. I'm talking about LBJ.
Yeah, there was definitely bad blood, especially between RFK, Robert F. Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson. And the Kennedy aides used to call Johnson Judge Crater, after a judge who famously disappeared because Johnson had a very low profile as vice president. They also called him Rufus Cornpone. So he wasn't too happy with all that.
Is there any favorite nickname that you have of any of the people that you've profiled?
Mies Case and Kaiser Soze are up there. I like that in the Nixon administration, there's a guy, Bolzano, who was called the Garbage Man because he'd come from the sanitation world, but he also was involved in kind of unsavory stuff sometimes. So I like that one.
No, it's interesting. I didn't realize how the backbiting there extended to nicknames. And now, were they widely used? Obviously, they made it to the press and they made it to the books, so widely used. Now, President Bush was called Bushy, which is more of an affectionate term. Were there any other names regarding the president, aside from Henry Kissinger, who called him, what did he call him? The Mad One. Aside from that, any other nicknames that people...
usually, in my experience, people call the president POTUS. Say POTUS this, POTUS that, POTUS that. And, a lot of these nicknames, they're kind of used in a jokey way, but it's not really a regular thing. Like, they wouldn't call you all the time by the nickname, but they use it to denigrate you, or maybe just even in that one usage to the press to embarrass.
No, but my question was, was there any, aside from President Richard Nixon being called the Mad One, were there any other nicknames regarding any of the presidents that you did research on? Was there a nickname for Jimmy Carter or for Bush or for Obama or for Trump or?
I mean, not that I'm aware of the aides using. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. But I mean, look, remember Lyndon Johnson was vice president called Rufus Cornpone, and then he becomes president. I would assume the people who didn't like him and called him that as vice president, and some of them stayed in the administration after Kennedy was shot, and they still used the name.
He still kept them on.
Right.
Okay. Anyway, I want to thank you for joining us. What's your next article going to be about?
Oh, I'm working on something on conservatives who died in 2021, and just do a little tribute to some of those people and honor them for what they accomplished. You may have known one of them as Sheldon Adelson.
Sure.
Passed away in
He
2021.
was a classic and a very down to earth. I never into, but I spoke to him a couple of times. Very interesting, very down to earth, and his wife is a powerhouse too.
Yeah, no, a number of the people who I talk about in this were Jewish, including Donald Kagan, who was a classics professor at Yale and grew up in Lithuania, was born in Lithuania. And then even Jackie Mason had some conservative tendencies, and he passed away in 2021. So stay tuned on that front.
Looking forward to that. Dr. Tevi Troy, he is a presidential historian. His latest article dealing with nicknames. He is currently a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Thank you for joining here with us.
Thanks, Zev. It's always fun.
Always look forward to having you back again.
Thank you.